Hello and welcome to Cut Through, Crikey's spin-free analysis of Australian news, politics and power. I'm your host, Crystal Andrews, and today I'm joined by Crikey's media reporter, Daanyal Saeed, to unpack the Parliament Sports Club scandal that blew up this week. We're going to get into it from beginning to end. Daany, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
This has been kind of a month-long story that has slowly been unfolding. So I think what I'll do first is just lay out the very basics. When we're talking about the Parliament Sports Club, we are talking about the organisation that puts on social sport during sitting weeks at Parliament House for politicians and staffers to participate in, which is something that they've been doing for around 20 years. So anytime that you have seen the Prime Minister over the years playing touch rugby or soccer on the lawns of Parliament House, it is very likely to have been organised by this club. And the club itself says that its own mission is to provide these active sort of social opportunities for politicians to build relationships with each other that cut across party lines in a low stakes and kind of fun environment, which in turn, they would say, helps foster collaboration, better decision making in Parliament, and therefore better outcomes for all of us, better policy, wonderful, wonderful things. So far, that's not terribly controversial. But as we now know, it wasn't just politicians and staffers who have been invited to come and kick around the footy at Parliament House. The club has been sponsored by businesses and external groups and organisations, a fact that was not exactly hidden from the public, but has suddenly been thrust into the news cycle over the past kind of 4 weeks. Daany, as I said, you've been following this story, so maybe you can walk me through exactly where this started.
Yeah, so this is one of those stories that I didn't think it was the kind of story that would blow up, and it all started just under a month ago. Henry Below at The Guardian, who does some great work on this beat, on gambling advertising reform and on the gambling lobby. He wrote an article around the sponsorship of the club. The sports club has a number of what it calls corporate members, they're sponsors, and they include a whole bunch of sporting bodies, firstly. So your Golf Australia, Football Australia, the Olympic Committee, the NRL, Rugby Australia, all these peak bodies are corporate members or community members of the club. And then you have a whole bunch of private sector companies as well. So Amazon Web Services, Ampol, Lion Group, Diageo. That also includes a lobby group called Responsible Wagering Australia, and that's the gambling lobby. That was sort of quite widely condemned by a whole number of members of the crossbench. And this is sort of where the story starts to snowball. So what is called the Australian Parliament Sports Club, it's a formal organisation, and it has, it has a CEO who I'm sure we'll get to. It has a board, it has directors, it has a sports advisory committee that has Mal Meninga on it. It has
Wow.
all of these sort of functions and vestiges of a proper company, so to speak.
So just to really make that point clear, the name Parliament Sports Club gives the impression that, it's like a workplace committee, that this is something that comes from within Parliament House itself and is
Yes.
operated, or is some sort of offering that staffers and politicians can choose to opt into if they want. But it's not. It is an external corporation that is so named to suggest that it is part of the Parliament operations itself.
No, exactly, and that's sort of how it positions itself as well. So a lot of people within Parliament House, your staffers, your MPs, were under the impression that it is this sort of casual lunchtime kick around, a casual morning kick around, the kinds of things that you and I might do with our colleagues on a Monday night playing mixed netball or whatever. But the reality of it is that this is a slightly bigger organisation. It's been organised over the years by a man named Andy Turnbull, who's a sports events businessman. He ran an organisation called Sports Hydrant, and that has run these parliamentary sports events on a Wednesday morning, invariably of a sitting week, for the best part of 30 years. The reason this blew up is on September 22nd of this year, the Australian Parliament Sports Club was registered as a lobbying organisation. We wrote a story saying that the Parliament Sports Club had been registered as a lobby group. It was sponsored by the gambling industry lobby, and notably has the Prime Minister as president. Sir Anthony Albanese is the president of the club. He was previously the chair, but in early July became the president. That was sort of the first step. David Pocock, who has been very passionate about A, gambling advertising reform, B, transparency for a really long time, and has a pretty sort of steadfast position on registration of lobbyists, came out in Senate estimates last week and quoted our story and put some questions to Penny Wong, who was there in estimates representing the Prime Minister.
Quite a combative exchange that Wong and Pocock had in estimates over this, which I think brought it to some wider attention. That seemed to be where this turned into a bigger issue of public interest.
Yes, this is when it became sort of a national story. He says, I know you're trying to get a grab. I'm sure you're just trying to get attention. And that clip sort of went around the country. And by Friday morning, David Pocock had been kicked out of the club for bringing it into disrepute. And the CEO of the club, Andy Turnbull, says that his position was untenable and that he expected David Pocock to have resigned of his own accord. This is when the PM starts to get involved. The PM came out and said, that's just David Pocock being David Pocock, getting himself in a story. Friday afternoon rolls around and Anthony Albanese now says, well, let's not kick him out. And he says participation should be open to everyone. He still thinks he says it's absurd that the Parliamentary Sports Club has the function of a lobbying organisation. Andy Turnbull says there's an unwritten rule that you don't talk shop while we're playing sport. This is fairly consistent with the reports that I get from staffers and from lobbyists and from MPs that no one's talking shop while they're playing, five-a-side soccer on a Wednesday morning. But I think, and the language that one particular political insider used with me this week was that was sort of sneaky language from Andy Turnbull, because it's not that people are talking shop while they're playing sport. It's the fact that you recognise someone in the halls of Parliament and that opens the door to conversations. And so it's this really weird tension between pretending that sport breaks down barriers for people and gets you to know people you wouldn't otherwise know, but simultaneously pretending that, well, in the case of lobbyists, that doesn't happen. Or in the case of vested interest parties, that doesn't happen.
Not everyone was taking as tough a stance on Pocock being kicked out as what the Prime Minister initially did. Pocock had a lot of support from the likes of Monique Ryan, I think Kate Cheney, Allegra Spender also quit out around
Sophie
about
Sconce
the same.
As well.
Yep, around
So
about
a lot
the
of
same
teal
time.
Politicians.
Yeah, but also some from the Labor Party as well did remark that, it's not fair and reasonable that he should be kicked out of this club for raising questions about it. Do we know exactly do we have like a member list? Do we know exactly who was part of this club? Or I know you've been chasing something down. Has it been fruitful?
Yes and no. So the reason for this, and I don't quite know why this is the case, but the way these things are organised is somewhat haphazard. So there's a separate, WhatsApp group or group chat for people who play soccer, and there's a separate one for people who play tennis, and there's a separate one for people who play netball. And so the trying to sort of combine those into a list of members has been difficult. Occasionally you'll see, you'll spot a lobbyist or you'll spot a journalist. So there's the photo that we used on our initial coverage of it was around the time, I believe, the Socceroos were playing New Zealand in Canberra. And so in there is Socceroos goalkeeper Paul Izzo and one of the coaches as well. But there's also AAP journo Dom Giannini. Henry Below says he's played in those games too. So there's those sorts of people around the Parliament as well. My understanding is you'll often have also public servants that come from up the hill or down the hill, as the case may be. But predominantly it's MPs and their staffers.
That does kind of bring us neatly to the crux of this issue, which is that you had this week reported on the exclusive that the club has now removed itself from the register of lobbyists. I do just want to put some of the details out there about this because I think there are some important details to note. So the Parliament Sports Club first registered as a lobby group on the 22nd of September. And at that time, it listed 3 key stakeholders, one being the CEO, Andy Turnbull, who we'll talk more about in a moment, but also the former Liberal government minister, Malcolm Brough, and former Liberal MP, Stuart Henry. So those are sort of like the key, I guess, contact people noted for the registration. It has now come off. It has done so on the advice of the Attorney General's Department, which it has shared with Crikey as well. In practical terms, what does it mean that the club is now no longer on the lobbyist register?
I get the feeling that in practical terms, it won't do much. The Attorney General's Department gave advice saying, well, actually, it wasn't the Attorney General, strictly speaking, it was advice from the Australian Government's Register of Lobbyists, which is administered by the AGD. And they told Andy Turnbull that it sounds like you wouldn't have to register. That conflicts with Andy Turnbull's account that he registered on the advice of a very senior member of the department anyway. So that's a little bit unusual.
Politicians can remain members of the club if they so choose to, although quite a few have said that they are cancelling their membership. And obviously David Pocock has been, that choice has been made for him. For all of the others who are currently members, they get to remain members. The deregistration process does not seem to affect any of that.
Yeah, it's worth noting as well that David Pocock, after this whole furor, and this adds to the stupidity of the story, is that David Pocock was invited back formally, and he has said, well, I don't want to do that unless you change your processes around membership. So to date, that invitation back has been rejected. But Andy Turnbull said in his statement to Crikey, which you can read in full, that this is just a private members club now, essentially, and politicians are part and privy to all sorts of different members clubs. So this is how it would function. In the statement, though, that Andy Turnbull gave to us, he said, the betting industry lobby group, Responsible Wagering Australia, has been a member of the club since July 2023, so that's just over 2 years. And since then, I've emailed members and senators on 40 occasions notifying them of Responsible Wagering Australia and other corporate members. Further, all football, so brackets soccer, the round game, the beautiful game, playing members have played alongside the CEO of Responsible Wagering Australia, who's Kai Cantwell, he's a former Morrison staffer, since that time on Wednesday mornings. There have been many other sporting occasions as well. The sports club has received income from corporate members and sponsors for 20 years without a single other person raising a single question. It is reasonable to assume everyone was happy with the arrangements, given they were notified of it every sitting week for 20 years. He really did say, if I'm going down, you're going down with me.
It's an incredible statement. I encourage everybody to read it. The link will be in the episode description. There's a couple of things I want to point out about his statement because I thought they were very revealing and again get to the heart of this story being really about what politicians and political operators think is lobbying versus what the public thinks is lobbying. So in this statement, Andy Turnbull points out that he himself has been a registered lobbyist since 2009. He points out that the advice that he received from the Register of Lobbyists advised him that the club does not meet that strict definition of lobbying as outlined in the Lobbying Code of Conduct. And he says that the club has never been paid to make representations to the government on behalf of others. But then he says this about the goals and the mission of the club. I am strongly of the opinion that relationships are enhanced and better decisions made if all stakeholders know each other better. We have put this forward as one of the club's objectives from the beginning. Now, Andy Turnbull seems to sit with the Prime Minister, Penny Wong, and I'm sure many others who are really sticking fast to that formal definition of lobbying, which says that the only thing that can constitute lobbying is if there is a client who pays a lobbyist. That lobbyist organises a meeting with an MP, and then that the client and or the lobbyist meets with that MP to talk about what they want to talk about, to make some sort of specific request or put forward their argument. That is the strict definition of lobbying. That is what
it's a reasonable definition as well. Like it's not an unreasonable definition, but it doesn't pass the pub test for people.
It doesn't. And I think the anger around this is that the public understanding of lobbying is something that is much more fluid and really speaks to influence, which is what the statement from Turnbull completely lays out plain as day how that influence works. It's the fact that business leaders, including of peak bodies that have a direct interest in what types of policy or regulation get passed or don't, what format they, what shape they kind of take, that these people can play a social game of sport with politicians and the staffers who are making those decisions every week during sitting weeks, develop that personal relationship, and then later on call upon that personal relationship to make the requests that they want. That is what the public understands lobbying to be. That is certainly what Crikey subscribers and readers have been telling us for the past 2 weeks that they understand lobbying to be. And the reason is because that is not available to the voting public. It does feel unfair. It does feel that business groups, executives of major companies across the country can get that access, can develop a relationship that a constituent might never get with their own elected MP. It really feels out of step with how the public understands these issues.
I think there's a couple of things you bring up there that are really great. I think the first part is a lot of people we spoke to didn't realize how formal and corporate this whole thing was. That's the first thing to sort of, I guess, bear in mind there. But the second thing is that the club advertises this sort of access, right? So it's $2,500 to join for corporate members, and it says that it allows you to access key opinion leaders and over 200 parliamentary members. Like, it's really not a lot of money, and it speaks to this idea of politicians and lobbyists and influence in Canberra and influence in this country being incredibly cheaply bought. And the public has already had an education in that. The public had an education in that across the course of the Chairman's Lounge saga, and across the course of Joe Aston and the Finns reporting on Qantas, and just how cheaply politicians could be bought and how easily policy influence can be bought. It's $2,500 to access the PM if you want to, in theory.
At the very least, as a contact making exercise, absolutely worthwhile as a way to become a familiar face to people. You rarely see such a good deal in this economy.
Right. Amazing ROI. That sort of stuff happens on a much smaller scale as well. There might be a case, there's all sorts of other ways in which sport is acknowledged as a tool of relationship building. And so every year there's a Press versus Polly's cricket game, which Andrew Probyn is very, very passionate about. There's all sorts of sort of acknowledgements of that. We'll start to see where the alternatives might lie. It might be that DPS, the Department of Parliamentary Services, takes over and has their own non-sponsored, non-corporate form of community sport. There's an ongoing squash competition in Parliament House that has been the case for a while, and it's completely casual, and that might be the kinds of things that take precedence.
There's one more element of this I think it would be remiss of us not to touch on. Responsible Wagering Australia, they represent 6 or so of the biggest gambling companies. And there is a very real, powerful and building frustration amongst the general public about the lack of action on gambling reform, something that the Labor Party itself was leading on. They had one of their own, the late Peter Murphy, spearhead a review into what should be done, come up with an entire proposal of how gambling advertising laws in particular should be reformed in Australia. The Labor government has not taken any action on this. And for my 2 cents on this, I think if the lead corporate sponsor or the lead, client kind of on this had have been another business, had have been Pfizer, had have been Ampol, had have even been, the Australian Olympic Committee, that maybe this story would not have blown up. But the fact that it was a gambling body and the fact that we have seen so little action on the promised gambling reforms is really what I think blew this up. If it had been any other corporate sponsor, we might not have seen this story play out in the same way with so much rage behind it, because this highlights where some of that resistance might be coming from and just how intertwined these groups are. Does it feel that way to you when you're talking about it with people? I know people have been messaging you about this story. Is that like the prevailing emotion?
Yeah, I think there really is a massive dissonance between what the public understands the impact of gambling advertising to be, and what the government has done on this, and also the government's understanding of sort of quote unquote acceptability. Our political editor Bernard Keane wrote a piece about how this is a government that is in office but not in power. I fear that this is a really great demonstration of that, where this is a government with a 94-seat majority, and they've gotten that way by trying to piss off as few people as possible. And now we're in this scenario where someone has to be pissed off, inevitably the gambling lobby, because there is a health crisis in this country of people affected by gambling. We're the biggest losers in the world. There's a male suicide epidemic. But we see coronial inquests all the time that talk about the impact of gambling advertising and of gambling addiction on people. And the government is trying to sort of reconcile those two things, and it can't really without pissing someone off, but it hasn't done anything on its own inquiry. But if I use that line in a government context, they'll say, no, 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 no. We've done more on problem gambling than any other government since Federation. Now, notwithstanding that the bar is on the floor.
Yeah, right.
David,
Like that might be true, but that doesn't mean that you're meeting the public expectation of what should be done and what could be done. Just because you've done more than those that came before doesn't mean it's anywhere remotely enough.
Exactly. And the main recommendation of that report was recommendation 26, and it said that the government implement a comprehensive ban on all forms of advertising for online gambling to be introduced in 4 phases over 3 years, commencing immediately. There was an urgency to Peter Murphy's report, right? The market has moved as well for people. So like Sportsbet, for example, took same game multi ads off free-to-air television months and months and months ago, because there was a public imperative. They understood that the market was responding in a certain way, and that there was a capitalistic incentive to reduce the amount of gambling advertising. I think they've made statements to this effect, that they recognize that the public has a reduced appetite for gambling advertising, and that they want to engage with wagering in a different way. That is extraordinary, that you're being outflanked to the left by a gambling company, the biggest gambling company in the country, the most successful one. It's extraordinary to me that Sportsbet understands that the public don't want to see gambling advertising. They're trying to minimize their liability by reducing that. And the government just keep kicking it down the road.
This is their own report. These are their own recommendations. It's not something that has been passed to them by a coalition government. This is completely their own cause.
There is bipartisan support. There is support from the Greens. There is support from the coalition. It really, really blows my mind that this government still sits and finds justifications in sitting on the Murphy report. The mail that we have is that there might be something coming by way of reform after the spring racing carnival in November, and so it's one last big payout for the gambling lobby. The only saving grace of the next 6 months is the fact that we're now in cricket season, and you can't bet in as many ways on cricket season as you can on footy. You can't do disposal counts and tackles and marks and whatever. Thankfully, because
the options are somewhat restricted.
The options are restricted, but the reason that the options are restricted is because this is a side discussion to sports gambling advertising is sort of integrity. Part of the reason you can only gamble in certain ways on cricket is because my people, God bless them, the Pakistanis, have an addiction to spot fixing and match fixing. And 15 years ago, there was obviously, that massive scandal with Mohammed Asif and Mohammed Amir in England. They still take money from the gambling lobby. Every big sporting co takes product fees, and they take a cut of every bet. But that arrangement is a little bit more, in Crude Australia's words, conservative. So there are 6 months after spring racing. There's a little bit of time for the government to make these sorts of reforms. There's a little bit of clear air until footy season starts again. But are they going to do it is another question.
Well, it's good to have at least some indication of where this might all go next. Definitely one we're going to stay on for Crikey, and one that I know that you'll be working hard on following as well, Dani. So thanks for giving us the update today. I really appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me.
If you're listening to us on a podcast app, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review Cut Through. And if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel. It all helps Crikey grow and gets our independent journalism out to more people. That's all for now. We'll be back next week.